Welcome back to the Bible in Context.
Where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
Yes, and we're going to try and dig into what does the author want us to know about Joseph.
Yeah, this is the longest narrative in the whole Genesis story.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's one of the most complicated, and if you're reading it correctly, it's one of the most, I think, fun books to read.
Yeah.
Or fun sections to read, and it really has the biggest climax, and so should have the most fun reading it. But
yeah.
The setup to the story is, Joseph here with his brothers, and there's some things that we need to understand about this first setup that really sets the stage for understanding the dynamic between Joseph and his brothers as we continue on through the story, because, the brothers play a very big role later in the story as well. So we need to understand this part first. And the first thing is, we read here that Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojourning in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Okay, so these are the generations of, so now we've transitioned into the story about, no longer about Jacob, but of his children. That's the next Toledot, if you remember us talking about the Toledot, which is translated as generations. When that word pops up, it's often a narrative transfer, a break in the narrative. And it says Joseph, starts off with Joseph immediately, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. Now, right there, we actually need to address a potential translation issue, even within this second verse here. And whether this translation issue is right or wrong, it's not really going to change the flavor of the passage itself. But if what I'm going to say is correct, it does add to kind of the thrust behind this section. So there's two ways to translate this verse. One is as it is in the ESV, Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. And that's the same way that most of our modern translations will take this. The other way to take it is to say that Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing his brothers with the flock. And the reason that is an issue is because the word for flock has this little Hebrew word et before it. And et can either be just a direct object marker, which is just like kind of saying the, more or less. There's some nuance there, but for the sake of the podcast, if you're not a Hebrew nerd, that's probably good enough to say it kind of is like saying the flock, or it can mean with. And so it could be he was pasturing with the flock. And then again, you have the word with his brothers. That with is a Hebrew bait, which can mean to, in, or with. And so if you were to flip the traditional meanings of et and bet to take them the other ways that they can normally be taken, you could say instead of pasturing the flock with his brothers, he is pasturing with the flock to his brothers. And that same et and bet construction is used down in verse 12. So you can go read that if you can read Hebrew and just see that the et and the bet are used in the same way. So that might be just some further evidence for reading verse 2 as, and again, if you don't want to remember anything else I just said, this is the takeaway, that this verse could be translated as Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing his brothers with the flock.
So in other words, leading his brothers.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the image of pasturing people, of being a shepherd of people, is used throughout the Old Testament of kings. And so this isn't a weird statement necessarily. This is a very cultural, apt description of a ruler. And there are quite a few, commentaries will bring up this translation. Sam Amati in From Prisoner to Prince brings this up, and he has a book analyzing the story, and he goes with that translation. So I'm not the only one seeing that, but that could definitely paint Joseph in a pretty poor light just 2 verses into this. He's 17 years old, he's a kid, and his brothers are out pasturing the flock, and he's out there trying to pasture them while they're looking after the flock. He's trying to be a leader, trying to be the firstborn, take it for himself.
Well, and he tattles on them.
Right.
Right.
And so that's, again, why you could take this either way. So he brought a bad report of them to their father. So it could have been he was just out there with them while they were pasturing, and then he brought a bad report back. Or it could be he was out there trying to rule over them, and then he brought a report back. So,
right. Well, and his father gives him a robe. Well, who wears robes?
Right.
Kings.
Yeah.
Right.
It's, definitely like this gift is showing like, hey, this is my firstborn. And really this word robe is the word used for the priestly robes as well. So that'll be significant. But let me back up real quick and just talk about this bad report. This word report, it does have a lot of negative connotations, and so some people might take this and say, like, look, he was just bringing a report that was honest, and they did something bad. Well, if you look throughout the words used throughout Scripture, and the word is dibah, it's usually applied to slander. And so this bad report, by using this word dibah, is trying to say, hey, look, this is slanderous, this is probably not honest. And so he's coming and lying to basically put them down and bring himself up. So again, I think it makes sense that he was trying to shepherd his brothers because he wants to puff himself up and put them down and make his authority more secure by making his brothers look bad in his father's eyes and making him look good. And so far, starting in verse 3, it looks like his scheme is working. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age. Son of his old age. Joseph was born before Benjamin. So he was the youngest son, the son of his old age, but he was also born in the same time he was in Padan Aram with his other sons. So wouldn't Benjamin be the son of his old age?
Yeah, you think.
Well, again, this is something that Sam Ahmadi and From Prisoner to Prince argues, and again, other commentators will talk about this as well, that term old age, zakenim, is only applied elsewhere in Genesis to talk about, or at least before this point, is used to talk about Isaac in Genesis 21, verse 2. And so what this might be doing is trying to put Joseph on par with Isaac by using this phrase. And so this, again, is coloring him as the chosen son, the favorite of his father, the loved one. And so, like you said, he makes him a robe of many colors. It's actually not of many colors. It means a long-sleeved robe. So the coat of many colors is just a translation that I think the KJV or some older translation like that just punted and tried to put something in here to make the coat nice, because that's what the connotations are.
Right.
But it's a long-sleeved robe that kind of has some priestly-seeming connotations, which will become significant later.
So the musical is wrong.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I forgot about that. Isn't it like a Mormon play or something? Or
that's a good question. I actually saw it when I was a kid up in Toronto. My parents took me to it, and we had like nosebleed seats. I don't remember it a whole lot. I was pretty young.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, it was Donny Osmond was in it.
Okay.
I just aged myself. Yeah, they take some theatrical liberties.
I mean, sure. Yeah, I mean, we still like to watch, what's that movie about with Charlton Heston and the Exodus?
So, the Ten Commandments?
Yeah, Ten Commandments, yeah.
Yeah.
Still watch that one on occasion. So,
yeah. Well, and there's been a lot of even Disney movies that have been...
that one's actually pretty good. Prince of Egypt?
Yeah.
That's a good one.
But doesn't he have a colorful robe in that one?
I think so.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly. It's been a while since I've seen that, but there are definitely some liberties taken. But
oh, yeah.
It's a cool movie.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so after he gets this long-sleeved robe that marks him as the firstborn, the brothers, they saw this in verse 4, and that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, and they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now, at this point, again, if the translation that I talked about is right, and also since the word bad report is a slanderous word, who can blame him? At this point, we're supposed to kind of feel sorry for the brothers and say, like, this little twerp is taking over and bossing his brothers around, and it's working. He's deceived their father as well.
Yeah. Well, and you can see the problem of favoritism continuing. I mean, Jacob's already favored Rachel and the problems that created, and now you're seeing him favor his son Joseph, and it's obviously creating some problems too. Yeah.
And so, I mean, going on, Joseph, to make matters worse, seems to have his desires confirmed in a dream as well. So God is now telling him, hey, you are going to be firstborn. When it says that he has a dream, and he went and told his brothers and said, hear this dream that I dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more because of this dream. Now, if just say you're in this scenario, your brothers hate you, and you have this dream of ruling over them, and it's something that is prophetic, what's probably the smart thing to do here?
Sell them into slavery. No.
I was going to say, don't flaunt it to your brothers.
You're asking, okay, what's the smart
Joseph,
thing? If you had this dream, and you know that there's Joseph doesn't show a whole lot of empathy, or he doesn't read the room very well.
No. Well, I think, too, he's loving the fact, like, he's been trying to strive for this firstborn, right? Now he's got it. He's like, guys, check this out. You know?
I just had this dream. You guys are going to be my servants.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Right. And then he has another dream where he says, even, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And then when he told this to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come and bow ourselves down to you?" And so they're taking this as, Jacob and Rachel, supposedly, and all the brothers are going to be bowing down to Joseph. And
interesting.
It says that the brothers were jealous of this, but Jacob, he kept these things in mind. So he was like, okay, maybe there's something to this. And he wasn't just taken over by the hatred that the brothers were. And I think here, so first of all, it does seem like even the characters in the story interpret this as Joseph's rulership. And again, this little brat is bragging about these prophetic dreams he's having instead of being smart and keeping his mouth shut and see what God's going to do. And there's actually a lot of articles out there on just different interpretations of these dreams, that maybe the characters got the interpretation wrong within the story, and there's other things going on here. I do think that the narrative weight and also just the aspects of the dream itself do just lend to a straightforward interpretation of this is Joseph ruling over his family. So there's a lot of really good and really smart and even creative articles on how to take these, but I think that this makes the most sense of the narrative tensions, and a lot of those other articles are trying to play on different narrative tensions to try and show how it's something different, and how if you look at these elements and do some gymnastics with them, you get a different meaning.
So like, don't read too much into the sun, the moon, the stars, and thinking that they're small g gods or something like that.
Right. Well, not even that. Jonathan Grossman, he has an article called 2 Models of Interpretation for 3 Pairs of Dreams. And he kind of shows how these dreams work together in different ways and how some of the elements of the various dreams link up. And then he uses that to try and show how Joseph's dreams don't mean what they do on the surface. You can go read his article if you want to. I'm pretty sure it's free on like JSTOR. So I don't really agree with him. Maybe you'll be convinced and will disagree with me. That's fine. But I think that the narrative weight and the elements within these dreams point to a pretty straightforward interpretation. Joseph, he's being a brat. He's trying to rule over his brothers. He's lying about them. He succeeds, and then these dreams come and confirm his desires. God has chosen him to be the firstborn, and he, in all his great wisdom, goes and decides to brag about it to his brothers.
Right.
And that's really the weight that we're supposed to see is Joseph he's striving for firstborn. His father affirms it. God affirms it. And he's not taking these affirmations the right way. He's lording it over his brothers.
Well, in that second dream, the fact that the sun, the moon, that the stars are bowing down to him, I do think it probably could mean that like creation is bowing down to him. And so the implication for his father would be, are you saying that we're going to have to bow down to you, even your mother and father? So I think that's an okay translation or interpretation.
I think actually, if I remember right, Grossman might have mentioned something about deification being part of it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of along with what you're saying. So again, there's lots of various interpretations out there. I take them to be pretty straightforward, but read some good commentaries. Even check out From Prisoner to Prince. I think he takes a pretty straightforward interpretation of them as well. But don't get too bogged down in all the details. But I think the narrative weight remains the same. That that Joseph is being affirmed,
creating this tension between Joseph and his brothers.
Yeah, with his firstborn status that he is striven for and acquired. And so, at this point, he looks a lot like his father, too. He's been strives with God. And then,
grabbing at the heels.
Yeah. And so, at this point, the brothers, they're pretty ticked off. And, I guess who can blame them at this point? We're supposed to, I think, at this point, not like Joseph that much and be like, why is he the firstborn? We kind of understand because we've already read Jacob's story, but we're sympathizing with the brothers more at this point.
Yeah. Which, his brothers have already proven to be pretty ruthless. At least a couple of them. Yeah, murdering entire cities, taking fathers' wives. They're not a great bunch, I guess. So maybe we don't feel too bad for them. At least some of them. Well, going on down to verse 12, where this story picks back up after the dreams. So in verse 13, Israel says to Joseph that he is going to send Joseph out to check on his brothers. And this, I think, first off the bat, we should just think like, okay, what happened the last time that he gave a report to his father about his brothers?
it didn't go well for his brothers. He slandered them. And so we as readers should be anticipating some problems. And I mean, with this too, with Jacob sending him, I think Joseph is being treated as kind of a firstborn, as a leader, as a someone who goes out on behalf of Jacob. And so we're seeing him again fulfilling this firstborn role. And once he gets to his brothers, they see him from afar and they plot to kill him.
Is there any significance to him going to Shechem where he thinks that they're supposed to be and they're not there? And so he's wandering in the wilderness?
Yeah, I'm not too sure. A lot of commentaries will just point out the fact that he had to walk like it's a long distance. But as far as like what's actually going on, how that applies to the narrative tension and what the author's trying to do, I really don't know what's going on there, like why he did that.
It may just be setting up the fact that his brothers went to a place where they could see him from a long distance coming towards them. So,
or perhaps they're no longer in their father's territory in Shechem, where maybe he owns that land now, the plot that he bought. So maybe they're kind of just out in the middle of nowhere, no longer near the settlement or something. That could be what's going on there. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. Well, regardless, they're able to see him from a far distance, and which gives them time to conspire together against him to kill him.
Yeah. And so they conspire to kill him. And in verse 21, we actually start to see this character that we mentioned in past episodes about Reuben, where he keeps trying to be a leader, but he's terrible at it. He wants to kind of reclaim that firstborn status as the oldest child, and he's just ineffective. In verse 21, it says, but Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let's not take his life. And then Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. And he said this, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. Now, why would he have done that? Was this an act of altruism?
I don't think so. I think this is Reuben, once again, like he did before, trying to regain power. I mean, he's the firstborn. He's wanting, just like I think it was last week we talked about Reuben sleeping with the concubine.
Bilhah, concubine. And that was his claim to power. It didn't work. So maybe if I restored Joseph to Jacob, maybe he'll look on me with favor and give me some authority back.
Yeah. So he's trying to regain some power.
Right. And that's why, we go down to verses 29 and 31. When he finds out Joseph is no longer in the pit, he says, where shall I go? And then he goes and joins his brothers in the plot. So he realizes, like, okay, this was my one plan to get back into the good graces of my father and regain some authority, possibly the firstborn status of my family. What can I do now? I guess I'll just go throw my lot in with my brothers and continue on with this scheme, not try to make things right anymore. I'm just going to go join in. So, Reuben, again, he's trying to be a leader, and he's terrible at it. So in verse 23, Joseph, he comes to his brothers, and they stripped him of his robe, the robe with long sleeves, it says many colors, but the robe with long sleeves that he wore. They took him and threw him in a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Okay, a few things here. First of all, they stripped him of his robe. That's going to be a key marker throughout the Joseph story, being clothed and unclothed. That continually, whenever Joseph is being elevated, even brought to the climax of an Exodus, you'll see clothing. When he is being pushed farther into exile, he is being unclothed. And we'll talk about that as it comes up, because that's really an important element throughout the Joseph story. So we'll see that again whenever he is in Potiphar's house as a slave. But again, we'll bring that back up. I just wanted to highlight that here while we're here. But let's talk about this pit. This pit is pretty significant. So the Hebrew word behind this word pit is the word bore. So this word is used in some key places with some very specific connotations that I think will lend some light to this story. So where else do we see bore show up, pit show up in Scripture?
So Psalm 30, verse 3, O Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol. You restored me to life from among those who go down to the pit.
And that is the Hebrew word bore again.
Okay. And then Isaiah 38:18, for Sheol does not thank you. Death does not praise you. Those who go down to the pit do not hope for your faithfulness. And so when he's saying pit here, are you saying that he's talking about just death? Like he's saying...
It's used a little more literarily in this story, but we see, here in Psalm 30 and Isaiah 38, the pit is compared to Sheol and to death.
Okay. Put him in a grave, in other words, is kind of what they're saying.
Sort of. I think we are supposed to read this as like this is a dry pit, or, maybe a dried up well, something like that. So we're supposed to read this, in actuality as a hole in the ground.
Okay.
But by using this particular word, and I'm the only one who has seen this.
There's a connotation of grave or Sheol that goes along with this word, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one of a few instances throughout the Joseph story where he is shown to be literally dead, essentially, going into literary death. So it's not meant to be literal like a grave or something, but it is supposed to show him descending into death. And these...
So they strip him naked and they...
Yeah.
and they kill him.
Yeah.
In a sense. Or he goes to death. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I see where you're going with that. Maybe there's something typologically going on there.
Yeah. It's just interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of little things from the Joseph narrative. And let me just say, so there's a particular reason I want to explore the Joseph narrative along the lines of the Exodus motif that we've been talking about in the podcast and the two goats motif that we've been talking about. Again, we'll recap those at some point in this series as it becomes relevant. But this is really a climax of the Genesis story that gives us a rounded picture of what the Messiah is going to look like based on the literary strategy of the author. So a lot of people, you read books, hear sermons about things in Joseph's life that look like Jesus, and so therefore these things that look like Jesus are predictions of Jesus. That's not how prophecy works. That's not how you create an expectation. Is by saying like just noticing the fact that Joseph is stripped and Jesus is stripped, therefore it's a prophecy that Jesus is stripped. That's not how that works.
Right.
But if Joseph is stripped in a way that fits into a literary pattern throughout the book of Genesis that has been built the entire time and then climaxes in this all-saving figure that is then projected forward into a coming Redeemer, then you have a legitimate expectation for something like that to happen. Or at least whenever you see Jesus stripped, you'll say, oh, okay.
This has happened before.
Right.
And I think it's more like the humiliation.
Yes, that's
maybe the typology that's happening here.
Yeah, I don't think we're supposed to read this as like, okay, this is a prophecy of Jesus becoming stripped.
Right.
But maybe the authors of the Gospels would write that in there to say, hey, remember that? It's kind of the same, like we're building just another element in the pattern that's there to try to link us back to, remember that guy from Genesis we've been expecting?
Right.
This is the guy.
Right. Yeah. We really do need to do a full podcast on prophecy.
We've been saying that I think every week for the past 6 weeks or something.
Yeah.
We'll get there. So anyway, this a really good book, again, just talking about this death and resurrection motif throughout the Joseph story, is a book called Figuring Resurrection, Joseph as a Death and Resurrection Figure in the Old Testament and Second Temple Judaism. It's by a guy named Jeffrey Pulse. Really, really good book. Definitely suggest it he just goes through a lot of the motifs and literary patternings that are happening throughout the Joseph story. So definitely worth reading if you want to understand the Joseph story. I take a lot of his principles and apply them to the interpretation of the story in my book and also in this podcast. So it's a useful tool. And so again, just as we saw in Psalm 30, David's life was drawn out of the pit. So we have Joseph in verses 28 drawn out of the pit, not for salvation, but for being sold to the Midianites who they saw passing by. And so, yes, he kind of has a prefiguring of the death and resurrection motif, but his descent into death continues on after this point. He goes down into Egypt.
His ascension takes a little while.
Yes, yeah, it does. And so one thing is, this is a place in Scripture where we see the Ishmaelites kind of playing the role of bad guy because they play a role in selling the firstborn son into slavery. There are I've seen this in actually some books by some really good scholars talking about how the gum, balm, and myrrh might be like funerary spices, and so it's kind of painting Egypt as a place of death. Egypt is a place of death, but I don't think that we're supposed to see the gum, balm, and myrrh as funerary spices. That might be the case. It might, but from what I can see, there's no determinate evidence that I've found that that's how we're supposed to read these particular spices. It could have been something just trying to highlight the wealth or something of Egypt instead. I don't really know.
Or just that Egypt is a destination place where we're going to do trading. I mean, it's a...
Possibly. I mean, I think it's interesting that they do name what they're carrying.
Yeah.
That probably is significant, but I just wouldn't put all my chips on, these being funerary spices. And even the scholars that have said that, they don't ever have a citation for that. And so... and when I try to look into it myself, it's like, well, there's gum, balm, and myrrh occur in a lot of places for a lot of different purposes. So I think to say that this is painting Egypt as a place of funerals and death. That's just an overreading of what's going on there.
Well, those same things are used again later on in Genesis 43 when Jacob sends his sons to Egypt. He sends them with some gifts, including gum and myrrh, nuts, honey, almonds.
Right. But yeah, those gifts, they show up in different places in the Old Testament. And so it's just too, you're overreading a bit to say that these are specifically funerary spices. They have multiple purposes that could be the purpose of them showing up here.
Right.
So Reuben, this is where we talked about Reuben comes back and he sees that the boy is gone and he says, where shall I go? And so we've already talked about what's going on there with him probably wanting to restore his status, and he fails once again. And so in verse 31, they took Joseph's robe that they had taken off of him to send him into exile and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And then they sent the robe of long sleeves and brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. And he identified it and said, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his sons many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. And thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, he was being sold to Potiphar. So in verse 25, we read that the caravan was going down to Egypt. And now we're looking at Joseph going down to Sheol to his son. That's the expectation. And I mentioned that in these two locations, that word going down to Egypt or down to somewhere is going to occur throughout this story. So this is just the first two occurrences. I'm not building the whole case on these couple of verses, but just wanted to bring it to mind. Now let's talk about Joseph's robe being dipped in goat blood.
Right.
The word blood is actually pretty rare throughout the book of Genesis. It only occurs here in Genesis 9, 4 through 6, where God is telling Noah to not eat blood and is told that whoever sheds a man's blood will have his blood shed by men. And then also in Genesis 4, 10 through 11, where it talks about Abel's blood crying out from the ground. Now, I think that one is particularly important, especially compared to Genesis 9, because Genesis 9, I think, is the natural expectation after Cain has just murdered Abel. He's given a command about man spilling the blood of man, and also just the importance of blood and not to eat it. But in Genesis 4, 10 through 11, with Abel's blood crying out, we have violence between brothers. And then we also have Abel being associated with a purification offering. And we talked about that back in the episode on Genesis 4. And here we see violence with brothers against Joseph. And then we see them slaughtering a goat and then dipping his blood. So he kind of becomes substituted with this sacrificial slaughter in a way. And so it seems to me this is replacing Joseph with the goat for Yahweh, the sacrifice from the Day of Atonement. And again, this has been pointed out by rabbis and modern scholars, where that swapping links us back to that two goats motif and puts him in the place of a goat that was slaughtered to essentially, in a metaphorical way, cover for their sins. But yeah, now it's taken Joseph's place. So you would expect now Joseph is going to be the goat for Yahweh that is ritually slaughtered and linked to the blood of a sacrifice or the blood of a goat, just like Abel was. But he's also the one being cast out of the land. Right. So just like the goat for Azazel that is sent out into the wilderness, he also plays that role.
Right. So, I wonder if there's another person that we will see later on in the story that plays the role of both goats.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's what we're going to see throughout the stories. Yeah, Joseph plays the role of both. And so, again, we're starting to see some expectations about, he's taking the shape of this Messiah figure. He's not linked to him yet. We'll get there. But you're already starting to see where this is going.
Right. Yeah, and once again, just like we saw with the story of Isaac, where there was a goat that was set up as a substitute. Instead of him dying, the goat died. Right.
So should we maybe run through just real quickly the steps of the two goats motif? Just to
good review.
We've mentioned that the first, actually the past couple episodes we've mentioned that between Esau and Joseph. So maybe we'd be better off just to run through those steps again, just so we're all familiar with what we're talking about, because that's probably a foreign concept.
Sure.
Okay. So there's usually about, again, 8 steps in this motif that I see. Others may nuance this, I don't know. But so there's typically a pair of brothers, and one is typically the older who is not chosen by Yahweh to carry forward the firstborn promise. And so this older brother then shows some sort of jealousy and hostility towards the chosen brother. And he begins to take the shape of the seed of the serpent, essentially, through that action. Then they are given a protection from Yahweh, giving them safety, or sometimes given an exodus themselves. Then they are exiled into the wilderness, and typically in the wilderness they become fruitful and multiply and become a great people. And these peoples often become hostile to Yahweh. Meanwhile, the chosen brother is brought into Yahweh's presence and sometimes associated with a sacrifice. And so we see some elements of that in this story. One is a non-oldest brother is chosen, and then there's hostility between the brothers. And so we're already seeing that and expecting this two goats motif to take place in this brotherly pattern. And then there's not a guarantee of safety, like we've seen that with Cain. He got a mark, and Lot, he was given exodus out of Sodom. And then this time, this is what's strange, is that instead of the non-elect brother being exiled out into the wilderness, we have Joseph, who is the firstborn, so we're expecting him to be the goat of Yahweh, or the goat for Yahweh. He is the one exiled out to the wilderness like the goat for Azazel, or like the non-chosen brother. And then we don't see him being made fruitful and multiply, but we do see some blessings come later down the road that'll kind of fill this picture out a little more. We do see that he is actually blessed and carried through by Yahweh, kind of giving him that protection that we'll see later on. It didn't come yet like it usually does, but we might see it in some form.
Well, and he's ushered into exile by the Ishmaelites, who Ishmael was another example of
non-chosen brother.
A non-chosen brother that would be exiled.
Yeah. And we've seen him also, again, he's the firstborn, but he's also associated with this sacrifice. He's replaced by a goat that's been slaughtered. So we have him through the firstborn status and this replacement associated with the goat for Yahweh. And again, just to remind everyone, why am I talking about the goats for Yahweh and the goat for Azazel? The Day of Atonement, this is what this is all pointing to. We see again these same elements where there's two goats on the Day of Atonement, where one is chosen to be a goat for Yahweh, the other is chosen to be the goat for Azazel. The goat for Yahweh is brought into Yahweh's space. He is slaughtered. Its blood is used to cleanse the tabernacle. The other one has the sins of the people put on it and carries them out to the wilderness, is exiled into the wilderness. And so we just see a few of the elements that point us back to this brother's pattern throughout Genesis. But I call it the two goats motif because I want us to remember the link between the Day of Atonement and these brothers. And we're going to see that Joseph actually does play kind of this redemptive role, similar to like how the goat for Yahweh will, and also the goat for Azazel.
Yeah. Well, are there some links between Pharaoh and Azazel, just being serpent-like creatures?
Well, Azazel is, like a wilderness demon, and so Egypt here is portrayed as death.
Right.
And so I think there might be something going on between those two things. And often in the Second Temple period, yes, this is a bit of their own interpretation in that period, but they saw the goat being taken out, and sometimes they would push it off a cliff, or actually have text about pushing it into the underworld, and so literally sending it to death. Those kinds of things. Those are, I think, misinterpretations of the actual intent of the Day of Atonement in some ways with what you do with that goat, which is what you see with Jesus. But yeah, we needed an episode on how this all applies to Jesus as well. I mean, you can kind of hear it already, I think, as we talk about it. But we need to make it a little bit more explicit because he does play both roles.
Right.
All right. Well, hope that was a good refresher just on the two goats motif. We've, I think, fleshed it out a little bit more, probably in earlier episodes, like the Genesis 4 episode, but...
or just get your book.
Or just get my book and just read it, because, I'm just kind of off the cuff trying to go through this again, but, get the book.
It's called Through the Waters.
Yep, Through the Waters, Biblical Theology of the Book of Genesis. But I hope that review...
By C.S. Lewis.
By C.S. Lewis. The C.S. Lewis. I still love that Logos got that mixed up. That was awesome. I shouldn't have said anything to him. Anyway, so I hope that was helpful as we kind of move forward in Joseph's story, just having in mind what the two goats motif is, and that we're beginning another Exodus motif as he is exiled. There's need for him to be given Exodus. And we often see the elect one, we always see the elect one go through an Exodus, so we're expecting that too. And the two goats motif and the Exodus motif are going to come to a head together at the end of Joseph's story for some really great typological expectations. Next, we'll pick up with, Judah and Tamar, which a lot of people think has nothing to do with the rest of the Joseph story. We're going to show that it does, and how there's actually a lot of really significant stuff going on in that chapter that links very intimately with Joseph's story.
Sounds like a plan.